Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. And in this episode, we're going to answer your questions that were submitted in 2024. It's January of 2025. We have some really interesting questions this month, Justin, that really are a little bit different than we've had the past few months, which is good. So we got some good variety here, a bunch of different states we're going to talk about, Oklahoma, Louisiana, of course, Texas, and different ways that people submitted these questions. So a few of these came in via YouTube. So if you want to catch the Mineral Rights Podcast on YouTube, just search Mineral Rights Podcast or search for Matt Sands Mineral Rights and subscribe to my channel. I have the audio of each of these episodes goes up on YouTube. And then when we do specific videos, such as we'll talk about the Oklahoma Corporation Commission how-to video that we did, that's where this one question came through. But be sure to check that out and subscribe if you haven't already. So, Justin, what was your take on the questions this month?
Yeah, I thought it ran a good gamut of different things that we don't often talk about. And so we'll get some variety going on here. And a timely question, even though this came in last year, for our first question here is about taxes. And this was something that was talked about a lot last year as property taxes came out in Texas, I know. But folks looking to protest the taxes charged on their minerals. In Texas, there was a big reporting issue which happened. Thankfully, the operators and the counties worked through that pretty quickly. But it sounds like one of those situations where you get the property taxes and you go, wait, this just doesn't make sense. And in my experience, man, I don't know what your experience has been, but you just go back to the operator, kind of work with them, and then work with the county as well.
Yeah, exactly. So Anna's question here is, Matt, how would you protest the taxes charged on my minerals that are nearly as much as the revenue I've received? Do they know something I don't? So this is a great question, Anna. And the way that the minerals are appraised in Texas, and I'm assuming that you're referring to Texas because generally speaking, that's the one state that charges the royalty owner based on the royalties that were received in the previous year. And so they have a whole methodology for calculating the value and basically determining based on the various mill levies for the county services that are offered, that'll determine how much taxes you owe. And from the valuation standpoint, they actually go through and they hire a third-party contractor that will determine the reserves for the entire well, for the full 100% working interest, and then from that, the royalty interest. And so what they do is generally speaking, perform a decline curve analysis, and they look at the future reserves and all of that. And then from a price standpoint, it's very interesting because the Texas Comptroller has a very specific way that each county is supposed to determine the price for the year. And basically what they do is they look at the previous year prices, and then at the beginning of the year, what the price is, and then make an adjustment based on that. So it's not always super accurate, especially if there's large swings in prices from year to year. And many listeners may have felt this pain again back in 2023, I guess it was, where we were paying taxes for 2022 and the prices were very high. And then, they fell quite a bit. And so then we were still basing the value, and the taxes were largely based on the prices from the previous year, adjusted down accordingly, as much as the formulas would allow. But ultimately, if you feel that your valuation of your minerals, and in your case, where you're having to pay taxes that are nearly as much as the revenue you've received, it could be an issue like Justin mentioned, maybe at this time, because this was submitted in June of 2024. So very well could have been that was before they made the adjustments and fixed the issues. Some counties had some significant issues like Justin mentioned. So that hopefully you've gotten that resolved and that was adjusted downward, because the value of your tax bill should be, a fraction of what you received. It shouldn't be nearly as much as what you received. So if that is the case, then I think you have a strong case to go back and protest it. And there's a whole process for doing that, and there's timelines and all of that. And in the county, when they send out the notice of valuation, will outline the steps that you need to take to protest it. And usually it's around the middle of the year. It's like July timeframe that you have to protest. And you have to act quickly, though, because there's a very short time period. It's like a 4 to 6 week period, I believe, where they need to get that application to protest it. And then you need to provide the justification for why you think it's lower. You can't just say, oh, it's too high. You have to actually provide some concrete information. And the more information you can provide that can justify a lower valuation, I think there's a higher chance of success. And this is my opinion here. But yeah, that's what I would do. Is they don't necessarily know something you don't. The other side of things is there could be a discrepancy. So like Justin mentioned, if you're not getting paid correctly on all of your wells, but then that information being sent to the county was adjusted later, there could be a discrepancy between your decimal interest in those wells or whatever, or there could be an error in the tax rolls that maybe they have the wrong information. So you need to go to the county appraisal district in Texas. So search for the county name space CAD, and that'll take you to the county appraisal district website where you can search for your property and go through well by well and check, or lease by lease, and check that your decimal interest matches what your division order or your royalty statement is, because that could be another issue. So that'd probably be the first thing. If all of that lines up, and I would protest it, and in the meantime ask the operator for more information about what they submitted to the county, because you have an issue, and they can hopefully shed some light on what's going on. So anything else, Justin?
No, I think you nailed it, Matt. I think the first step is really kind of trying to figure out where did that problem happen? Was it on what the operator reported side? Was it on the county side? And no promises, but I would certainly reach out to the county tax assessor. They typically have a public phone number that you can contact, and they can be very helpful typically to help figure this out. And just be sure you know your information, like how much income you had, those kinds of things, so that you can compare it. And I'm sure they'll give you some guidance on what to do.
Absolutely. Well, good luck.
All right, Matt, our next one here is for Oklahoma. And this is from Robbie. Robbie, it was a comment to a YouTube video that we did. It looks like it was the Oklahoma Corporation Commission video, which is a portal where you can look up things like production information, what leases may be happening, that kind of thing. And his comment here was, this is all good and fine, but if you inherit mineral rights, etc., on land you don't own in Oklahoma, you can't get the minerals without negotiating with the surface rights owner. My neighbor has never let a mineral rights owner drill a well on his property for over 15 years. And Matt, Oklahoma is interesting, and they have the accommodation doctrine, which I know you know a lot more about. And the estate is dominant estate, mineral estate. They handle it a bit differently.
Yeah, I would say as a general rule, the minerals are the dominant estate, so that you have the right to access the minerals below the ground. And like Justin said, you have to follow the accommodation doctrine, which just is basically that you have to be reasonable in working with that surface owner. So if it's a vertical well and the surface owner does not want to negotiate a surface use agreement with the operator to allow the well pad on their property, then that would be a blocker to allowing the well to get drilled. But fortunately, with the advent of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, most wells are horizontal in nature. So if your neighbor just for whatever reason does not want to have a well on his property, the operator can go to another surface owner and negotiate a surface use agreement and place the surface location on a different tract, and then drill under his grumpy neighbor's property, under your minerals basically, and you would benefit from that. So it really depends on where it's located and what type of wells are being drilled. If it's more of a conventional play where they're going to drill vertical wells, then yeah, you may be sort of stuck until that person, or if the property changes hands and someone else is more agreeable to allowing a well location on their property on the surface. Or, like I said, they'll work with additional neighbors to find out if somebody's willing to have the surface location there. And of course, there's lots of constraints that go into all of this, as in terms of like the offset well locations and where they can drill, and they want to do it in an optimal way possible so they're not stranding minerals. And so there's obviously certain locations that are better than others. But I guess the silver lining to this is it doesn't mean that a well won't get drilled, it just means it needs to probably be placed at a different location.
You said it, man. Yeah, and things can get really technical there. And, when an operator becomes interested, this is all things they're thinking about. And I think a lot of people will think, oh, you could just give an operator a call and they'll come drill a well anywhere. It's just not quite how it works. It's a lot that goes into that location selection. And part of it is who owns the service and how willing are they to work with the company. All right, Matt, our next one here is from a YouTube video as well. It says, what are the rights for a division order signee? Our father passed away 2 years ago. All the required documents have been sent to the operator, but over 9 months have passed and all the requests to have division orders sent to my siblings have been ignored. Probate was completed some time ago. All the docs have been filed in the county where the wells are located. And he goes on to say that this is in Chambers County, Texas. Matt, this is something we hear all too often and can get tricky, but a good oil and gas attorney is worth their weight in gold in these situations.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that definitely looking for an attorney that can help you get this unstuck with the operator. Sometimes a polite but sternly worded letter from an attorney will help expedite things. But, one question I have for you is, have you contacted them to find out why the division orders haven't been sent? If there's a title issue still, I know that you said that you've filed the documents in the county where the wells are located, but maybe there was an issue with that. Maybe something didn't align with the probate records and they have the interest in suspense. And so they're waiting for a resolution potentially on that title issue before they can issue division orders. So that would be the question for them. I would reach out to the operator and find out why it's taken so long, make sure that they have everything they need, maybe resend it. It's very possible that the person that you sent it to originally, left the company or something and the ball got dropped. So it's just, you got to be persistent. So the moral of the story when working with the operators is polite persistence pays. So, I would just be persistent, find out what's going on, and then send them any additional information they need to get the division orders going to you so that you can get put in pay status. And of course, in Texas, they do require a signed division order in order to place you into pay. The thing you want to be very careful with, and again, this is where the attorney can come in handy, is making sure that the division order does not amend or adjust any of the terms of your oil and gas lease. And so if you have a question about that, we'll link in the show notes to the NADOA, that's the National Association of Division Order Analysts, model division order form. And that's sort of what it should look like. And if you are unhappy with the form that the operator sends to you, in terms of it having a bunch of things that are adjusting your rights, or maybe you're signing away some of your rights, you can use that model division order form and send them that and say, hey, yeah, that's great. I'm not going to agree to those things. Or you can just frankly cross those additional contentious terms out and then leave the things in there that are required or that are recommended per that NADOA form. So hopefully that helps. And hopefully by the time you're listening to this, you've already been put into pay status. So good luck.
You said it, man. Yeah, it certainly can come across as a hurry up and wait kind of game, but typically the operators are really helpful and there to help you try to figure out what's going on. All right, our next question, Matt, is about Louisiana. So Edith says, I'm a fairly new Louisiana mineral rights owner with questions about the way my royalties are being paid. She says, I followed your podcast and calculations you presented are specific enough that I think I can do them, but I can't find the spacing unit for my property. She's asking for help in determining that. And then has another question related to a 1099 showing a revenue amount before they deducted taxes and other expenses, and has some questions about what she should be saving for taxes, which is always a common question.
Thanks for your note, Edith. I would say for the first question, you would need to go to the Louisiana SONRIS website. So that's the Oil and Gas Commission website, and they have a GIS map, and you can go find your wells. And there you'll be able to download a copy of the application for permit to drill, or APD, which is basically the document that shows where the well is located, the unit size that you need for that decimal interest calculation, and then how much of the unit production is going to be allocated to the section where you own minerals. And so there was some back and forth on email, and she sent me her legal description. So I looked it up. And in Edith's case, it appears that she should be getting paid royalties on 6 horizontal wells that go through her section. And 50.22% of those well bores are producing from her section. And those wells were completed in 2022 and are operated by Aethon Energy. So in your case, Edith, to calculate the net revenue interest on those wells, you would take your number of net acres divided by the number of acres in that section and then multiply that by 50.22%. which reflects the percentage of the production allocated to your section. And then you multiply that by the lease royalty rate for your tract. And since it sounds like you were not the landowner when the original lease was signed, you may need to look that information up based on the name of the person you purchased the property from, assuming they were the ones that signed the lease. And if you just find a memorandum of lease recorded with the county or the parish, then you would need to go to Athon to get a copy of the full lease that shows your lease royalty rate. And once you have all that information, you can then go and calculate your decimal interest. And that'll help you make sure you're getting paid correctly. And I know her concern was in the second, the question is, how does she make sure that the amount is correct? And so what you would need to do is go back and compare your 1099 to your royalty statement. And we did an episode 97 on how to audit your oil and gas royalty statements. And it's a quick end of year audit you can do. And this is a great reminder for everyone that as we get ready for tax season, we'll start to get 1099s in the mail. When you get those, you can compare your last year's revenue statement, the last one that you received for the year, and make sure the gross royalty amount matches what's being reported to your 1099. So that is the number that should match up. There are deductions, and that's when you complete your tax return, you'll provide the deduction information and tax information that you paid and any qualified expenses you might have incurred during the calendar year that you could subtract from the income. So example, you contacted a appraiser or an attorney or a landman and you spent some money on that, you might be able to deduct some of that. Again, check with your CPA to get advice specific to your situation. And of course, this shouldn't be construed as tax advice, but just general information purposes. So again, that's how you can make sure that the amount is correct, and it will be higher than the money you actually received in your bank account. And that's because what's reported to the IRS is the gross royalties. And then of course, when you file your tax return, you'll have those adjustments, right, to your income in terms of whatever post-production deductions they subtracted, whatever taxes you paid, whether ad valorem taxes or production taxes to the state. And that net amount, when you file your tax return, is what you end up paying taxes on. So don't worry, as long as your CPA is familiar with how to file taxes for royalties, those are things that will be taken out on the tax return. And then also make sure you're taking advantage of the depletion deduction, which is a 15% deduction off of your royalties, again, depending on your specific situation, but that's sort of like depreciation, but that's another definite tax benefit you want to take advantage of when you file your taxes. So good luck, Edith. All right. Okay. Our next question here comes from Karen. And she says, I own 40 acres in the Haynesville Shale, and I'm receiving royalty payments from Tellurian for a bit longer and SWN. My most pressing need is to get my hands on the formulas used in computing revenue statements. So this ties back to Edith's question. So Karen, as far as the process for calculating your decimal interest, you can go through and look up your wells and look at the specific percentage that the multi-unit well goes into your section. And assuming this is in Louisiana, if it's in Texas and the Texas side of the Haynesville, then it could be slightly different, but I don't believe SWN is an operator on that side. But anyhow, the process is the same. So you understand once you have your decimal interest, what you want to do is comparing and computing your revenue statements. You're going to look at the volumes that were produced. And so you can look at the state oil and gas information. Again, for Louisiana, that's that Sonris website, or in Texas, it's the Texas Railroad Commission. There they report the production volumes for gas and oil, and you can use that to make sure that matches up with your revenue statement. So thanks for your question, Karen. And again, just go through that previous answer. And if it doesn't answer your question, feel free to write in with any additional help you might need. So good luck. All right. So our next question here comes from Tracy. Tracy says, hello, thank you for the podcast. I've learned a lot. I have a question about taxes on condensate in Texas. I have a 5% working interest in a well, and she gives the lease number and the county. And she says, then they withhold taxes out of my interest on both gas and condensate. The amount withheld on the gas roughly matches what is on my statements and the Texas Comptroller's site, but the Comptroller's site shows the tax rate on the condensate is 0 and the tax due is 0. The purchaser is listed as the primary taxpayer on the condensate, not the operator. Is the condensate tax due and paid reported somewhere else or being paid by the purchaser? And perhaps I shouldn't be charged for that if my operator isn't paying it. Just curious if this is a question you can answer and maybe help myself and others. So that's a great question, Tracy. And I did a little digging on this on the Texas Comptroller's website. And here's what it says. It says the first purchaser of crude oil in Texas is responsible for paying production taxes on crude oil production. Natural gas taxes are primarily paid by a producer. Depending on the contract between producer and purchaser, both parties can agree that a purchaser will pay the natural gas taxes. So the takeaway there is first purchaser has to pay the taxes for oil, and then it could be the producer or the purchaser for natural gas. So that may be why you see that difference. In that case, because condensate is the liquid, generally I think it's treated as oil from the tax point of view. So the purchaser is required to pay that. Of course, any CPAs that are listening, you can correct me if I'm wrong there. But if you want to look at the specifics and seeing whether or not the well qualifies for a tax exemption. So the reason that the Texas Comptroller's site shows the tax rate on the condensate as zero and the tax due at zero could be because there's an exemption, a tax exemption on that well. There's the Kong system, the crude oil and natural gas system, which we'll link to in the show notes, allows you to search the Texas Comptroller's website. And if that is the case where there's an exemption, you'll see the exemption type and the beginning and end period, and it'll show you the percent exemption for the condensate tax. So it could be that that well was what's called a 2-year inactive well, which according to the comptroller forms, oil sold after the Railroad Commission certification of that status, they're eligible for tax exemption for 5 years. So it could be that they have that 2-year inactive well status for the oil. Don't know why it would not be the same for the natural gas as well. But it's very possible that the operator did not update their accounting software. So maybe they're incorrectly charging you taxes, or it sounds like they're incorrectly charging you taxes if the comptroller site shows that zero taxes are due. So I would contact the operator and see what you can do about getting a refund on the tax that you've overpaid for the wells that were exempt. So yeah, hopefully that helps, and good luck with that. And again, this shouldn't be construed as tax advice or legal advice. Definitely check with your CPA and or attorney for guidance specific to your situation. You can send them copies of those statements and you get their help in getting down to the bottom of it. So again, there's some additional information we'll link to in the show notes as far as natural gas production taxes and crude oil production taxes in Texas and who's responsible and the percentage rates and things like that. It's different, again, for gas versus condensate. Condensate tax rate is 4.6% general, which matches what oil is. And so they kind of treat it from the same way from a tax perspective.
Okay, Matt. So our next one here from Brad, it says, thank you, Matt. I do have a question in case you have time for it. We're no longer receiving payments for a year or so for a 0.08% working interest on a lease that must have been earned by my father, a geologist now deceased. He exchanged his expertise for the interest owned by an old friend, the producer, who is also deceased. We dropped the ball when we didn't notice the stop, which could have been due to our failure to notify of a mailing address change, or possibly the payer wasn't sure of current owner due to effects in estate administration. And then it goes on to say that since that began, the producer sold the lease to another producer whose behavior is the same. We still receive our monthly share of expenses, but no income. It sounds like he thinks he might be getting the runaround from the operator, and they've been given several reasons which don't add up for why they're seeing the expenses. But Matt, this is something we often talk about with working interests. This is a situation you can certainly find yourself in, and there are some valid reasons for it. And then there are some times that they can take advantage of the owners.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that in this case, Brad says the production records show nothing has changed and it's producing similarly to past years. And he says, while it's not a lot of income, it has been more than the $100 minimum needed to accumulate prior to issuing the check, as suggesting one time when I called. Other reasons given were things getting wrapped up from selling and tax season for the CPA who does their books. They say it'll happen after that, which was last April. I much appreciate any ideas. Thank you. So Brad, yeah, like Justin said, this is something that can happen when a well changes hands. And so there is definitely a time period during that transition where things will slow down, and it may be a month or two before you start receiving checks again. The thing that is kind of suspicious, I will say, is the fact that you're still receiving those joint interest billing, those JIB statements for the expenses, and they're expecting you to pay your share of expenses, but then they're not cutting you the revenue check. So that is red flag to me. So I would definitely get help from an attorney, number one. And what I'm about to say, preface this with the fact that I'm not an attorney, and this may or may not be the best course of action from like a legal standpoint in terms of that interest and whether or not you go non-consent or not. Because if there are some AFE costs or things like that and you don't pay it, then they'll put you in a non-consenting interest owner perspective, and you won't get paid until that expense is paid off. But what I would say is I would maybe hold off on sending in those expense checks. If you're not getting paid the revenue that offsets those, because presumably this is still a profitable interest from your perspective. If you take the revenue minus the expenses, you'd still be a net positive. Assuming that's the case and they're not cutting you your fair share from the revenue, then I would put the pressure on them and stop paying those expenses, because that's really the only leverage you have. And we're going to hold off on paying these expenses until we get caught up on the revenue side. And what they should be doing is netting you out, right? So if you have a positive amount and they subtract those expenses, they'll pay you the net amount. So that's one way that it can happen. Other times they do issue the full amount and then you have to pay the expenses each month. But I would definitely put pressure on the current operator and look at your rights. You didn't mention what state it's in, but look at the state statute. There are protections in place for recipients of revenue from oil and gas wells. And there is certain time periods when the operator, the producer, or the first purchaser is required to pay you. And if they're not following that, you have potentially some rights you can exert under state statute. And again, that would be best, to get help from an attorney to find out what your rights are and find out how to best exert those. And it's probably, again, like we said, polite persistence and a strongly worded letter from your attorney will get them off high center and hopefully get you paid. So, Justin, anything else to add there?
No, I think you nailed it. And, the working interest situations can get highly complicated. So a good place to start is talking with an attorney to understand what that document says, what rights you may have, and just get an idea from them what they think the best course of action is in your state.
Yeah, absolutely. And that reminds me that the other document that you should have a copy of is the Joint Operating Agreement, or JOA, and that will list the specific rights in addition to whatever is in the statute. So it may be different than that. So that is definitely something you need to get a copy of. Sometimes those are recorded in the county, just depending on the situation. If it's a unit, like a federal unit or something, they'll have the full operating agreement in there and this breakdown of interests and stuff like that. But if it's not, you may need to go back to your late father's files to try to find a copy of that, or assuming the producer will be willing to give you a copy of that, that is something you can ask for them, and certainly want to maintain a friendly relationship so you can get that type of information, but then just be persistent in exerting your rights. So yeah, good luck, Brad.
All right. So that takes care of it for the questions we have during this episode. This was a set of different questions that we don't cover a whole lot, especially with Oklahoma. Things there can get interesting. And Louisiana, Matt, we were recently at one of the meetings for the National Association of Royalty Owners, and it's just a completely different beast altogether.
Yeah, we were talking with Danny Wells, who's the new Louisiana chapter president, and he's a landman and a timber manager in Louisiana. And it is a whole nother animal for sure. So if you're in Louisiana and, like a couple of these questions where there's some very specific things, like the fact that if there's no production, the minerals revert back to the surface owner. So it's sort of a situation where you can have a difference between who owns the minerals and the royalty interest. And there's different terms for that, like servitude owners and things like that, which is a very different animal. But yeah, certainly something interesting and unique, but an area where I'll be the first to admit I am not an expert in Louisiana. And if you need help in Louisiana, I can always get you in touch with Danny, who's the resident expert there and our National Association of Royalty Owners state chapter president for that state. So great questions. Thanks again for submitting. Again, if you have a question you'd like us to answer, send it to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com, and we'll get you an answer on the air. And thanks again for listening. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.